For decades, China, among other developing economies, has been a major importer of plastic waste. But after banning all scrap plastic imports earlier this spring, waste exporters have shifted away from China into Southeast Asia. But the question is why people did that from the very beginning, to import waste. This change has made countries such as Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand also imported brunt of international waste, doubling or even tripling their imports of scrap plastic in recent months. In response, Thailand placed a prohibition and possibly an indefinite ban on these imports, following Vietnam and other Southeast Asian neighbors. The issue of waste and environmental protection has always been a big concern for developing countries, China included. For more about China's ban on waste imports, we are joined in Beijing, Wu Changhua, Director of the Professional Association for China Environment, or PACE. Welcome, ma'am, to our program.
Thank you.
People wonder why would the developing countries, China included, such a big one, import waste and plastic waste?
Historically, there was an obvious reason. So a few decades ago, in 1990s, early 1990s, when China really started to faster industrialization, and we needed materials. And back then, actually, the material industry in China was not very well developed, and there's also cost issue. So somehow importing those wastes coming to China becomes something valuable. So that literally created a market. And
but that was at the very beginning, and then things went very different direction.
Well, no, that lasted for about 2 decades, honestly. And even though China had laws, regulations about solid waste management, including importing solid waste, but somehow, if you look at the numbers between 1996 and 2015, actually, and the number 10 times higher. So there was a great, huge market there. Then, of course, as the industrialization continued and China got to a certain level of development, and if you look at the materials, actually, we have a much stronger material industry. And the environmental side, I think the laws, regulations, awareness becoming much, much stronger in this country. So there was much limited, actually, loophole for waste like that. One major challenge in the importing process is that we didn't really pay enough attention to environmental hazard and health hazard. I think that caused a major challenge to the country, and that's a weakening call, and we are trying to deal with that.
That is one thing. The other thing is about the country that is exporting those wastes to the other countries, particularly to the developing economies. One is ethical issue. The other is about the development issue. That is, what roles different countries are likely to play in the overall global development.
Absolutely.
What do you make of that?
I think, Western countries over the decades have been sort of championing the environmental agenda globally, right? If you look at the environmental governance. But there were certain areas, hidden areas, not paid enough attention, particularly on the waste issues there. And the domestic laws regulations literally created very little space for them for landfill. There was not much, actually, space for landfill anymore. And the cost, actually, to handle the waste becomes so high. So then they need to find a way out, and exporting those trash, actually garbage, to developing countries somehow became the solution. And in that process, not many people paid attention about the ethics, about the impact, environmental impact and healthy impact to developing countries. And somehow, I think we just sort of actually let it out there, for a while. But now I think in the recent decade, there's overall general awakening to the environmental healthy impact there. I think now it's a time to really put this on the table and trying to figure out what to do with that.
Yeah. After understanding the China story, let's take a look at the world globally. So may we also invite 2 other guests. One is Isabel Hilton, who is the CEO and editor of ChinaDialogue.net. That is a website that is focusing on environmental issues around the world, particularly the issue of China. In Washington, D.C., we also invited Michael Dorsey, who is a member of Club of Rome, who's also the co-founding director of the Center for Environmental Health. I want to welcome the other 2 guests as well, Isabel and Michael. Thank you so much for coming over to our show. Can things change, Isabel, change dramatically when it comes to the so-called dumping of waste into developing countries, when it comes to, quote-unquote, the, how shall I say, the way of developing countries try to produce their raw materials?
I think things certainly can change, but I think that the existence of the China market, particularly for plastics, and China was taking about half the world's plastics until very recently, kind of let developed countries off the hook, because consumers thought that plastics were being recycled. It was, as we've heard, being shipped to China. It was also being shipped often in a very poor way, so contaminated, not properly sorted. And if you look across the whole chain of production of plastics to the consumption to the recycling, you can see problems in every part of this chain. But I think things can certainly change, and I think the China ban has brought home to developed countries that how much they need to change.
Right.
The problem is not that we don't have the capacity, it's that the organization of everything from what kind of plastics are produced, how they were used, how they're designed, and how they're then collected requires, it requires a structure. It's not so much a technical issue as an issue of policy and organization and incentive.
Okay, Michael, what about that? Can things be done in a short-term matter? Because after all, these wastes are being produced every day. And after all, they have to be, in a way, dealt with in the developed economies, let's just say.
Absolutely. Now is the moment to begin to, I think, step even further than China has, and to talk about a global conversation on the need to ban the trade in waste, and certainly in plastic waste, PVCs in particular. This is a critical moment. China, I think, is sending a signal to the world of what needs to happen. The United States, the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, has studied the issue of what they call environmental racism. That's the dumping of toxics and hazardous material on poor communities in this country, but they also look at that issue globally. And so we know over the past generation the policies of the United States have really largely been based in an ethos of environmental racism, pushing the dirty waste around the world to those lesser economies in the world, not just China, but in South Asia and so forth, particularly in Africa. That's a problem that's got to stop. I think the challenge going forward, though, is not just banning things like PVC and plastics and so forth, but really moving a conversation to redesign products. That's a conversation that we haven't had much global leadership on. We need some of that. Moving a conversation to get out of the short-termism. There was certainly some economic value that China received for dealing in those waste over the years, but that was really marginal. We've got less than 10% of recycling goes on in the waste stream system. It's really, really low.
Right.
It's not that valuable at all. It's a good step for China to ban something bad as opposed to doing things like banning people.
But here's the challenge. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, you understand this much better than I do. That is, climate change, environmental protection has been a key issue the world embraces over the past 1 decade, let's just say. But of course, geopolitical changes, new leadership in some countries has, in a way, pushed against the global trend of deal with it. And now things seem to be in a very different light. So, Michael, you're coming from one of those countries that are facing this kind of challenge. The question is, can it be done? I want to throw it back to you under the very different light.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that it's not just a single country issue. It's certainly not just a U.S. problem or a Chinese problem. It's truly a global problem, and there is an upside to this particular problem. There is a multi-billion-dollar industry in packaging, and we can imagine a multi-billion-dollar industry in the rethinking of packaging. It might even be a higher upside than that. So there's an opportunity here when we think about what comes after banning the waste trade, banning the movement of waste and hazardous materials, plastic and other sorts of things. There's an upside to this, and that's really in the redesign. That's also in the short term. That's in the management of plastic waste. That's in the management of waste overall.
Right, that's been
mentioned.
mentioned.
There's a very low-end global conversation there.
But Isabel, structural reforms, that's what Michael seems to be suggesting, underlining his answer. That is not easy for a lot of governments to do. And politics are being used in order to delay that process, as you may know as well. So the question I want to go to you as well about whether it can be done and it will be done efficiently, or rather there will be more zigzagging in rhetorics, not actions.
I think I'm afraid we live in a world where zigzagging and rhetoric are rather on the rise. But certainly, if you look at the situation in Europe, there's a high degree of consciousness about this. And the China ban, I would hope, would actually lead to countries in Europe producing better policy rather than simply looking for cheaper markets or existing markets to dump. We've seen the knock-on effect of the China ban, where it goes to much smaller countries which very rapidly find they can't cope. So I think we've had a sort of two-stage, let the market sort it out, and the market clearly can't sort it out, and we're going to have to come back to policy, and we are going to have to look at the complete supply chain and redesign it so that recycling is real and not just an illusion.
Changhua,
but I think it can certainly be done.
Yeah. Changhua, you know, there's a tendency of kicking the can down the road, right? You just delay all the hard work and put it into a political framework as if that is the issue. So, Changhua, what do you make of that? Can developing countries here play a role besides banning it and also lead the process of structural reform?
The short answer is yes, but I would probably take one step back, look at the overall picture.
Go ahead.
I think the China ban definitely has triggered a global revolution, or accelerating solutions. Laws, regulations are being put in place, if you like, Australia, US, and Europe, Japan, among others. So there's a very positive impact, you know, when China issued the ban. From the market perspective, and it's very exciting to see, you know, like Apple, you know, leadership companies like Apple, Alibaba's Cainiao, JD.com, among others, they all come on board actually committing to, for instance, Apple's closed loop and Cainiao's commitment with a sort of a green, smart logistic city sort of model, restructuring not only the product design itself, but also the recycling, the material flow system there. And in that process, to integrate the digital technology and like blockchain and AI, among others. So I think I feel very confident, actually. I think things are coming together, and particularly because of ban from China, and we are witnessing a much accelerated, actually, solution.
Having said that, though, what would be some of the specific factors that all of you as experts in the field would concentrate on to see about the speed and efficiency of the change, and also as the critical areas for change? Isabel, briefly from you first.
Well, first of all, we need much stricter regulation on what type of plastic is produced and in package design, because a lot of consumer items at the moment, they are combined with other materials, and that makes them unrecyclable. Secondly, we need to look at chemical recycling rather than physical recycling, because physical recycling degrades after 2 or 3 generations, and then it ends up in the ocean. And thirdly, we need to look at what, certainly in terms of ocean pollution, what are the really big problems? We have a lot of gesture politics going on at the moment, like companies banning plastic straws. That's a tiny, tiny part of ocean pollution. It's important for consumer education, but for example, the biggest source of ocean plastics is discarded fishing tackle. Now, how do you tackle that? So let's take a scientific and a rational approach. You know, certainly the consumer is an important part in giving political permission for good policy. Consumer plastics are not in themselves the huge problem.
Changhua, your answer?
I would probably, at this moment in China in particular, focusing on the e-commerce landscape. Because, you know, many consumers are now connected with the e-commerce, and that's the entry point, intervention point, where you can get individual consumers to be actively engaged to change the behavior, starting with the families, right? Garbage sorting, make sure they put different waste actually into different bins and put them in the right place. And in the meantime, of course, reducing the waste and recycle, reuse. You know, I think all the 5 R's actually need to be put in place. I definitely see e-commerce as the biggest opportunity.
Michael, last but not least.
You know, I think we're going to see 3 things coming forward. It's going to be about prices, it's going to be about power, it's going to be about politics. And we saw that in this ban. I think the power of China to say we're going to ban this is really catalyzing action around the world. There's an upside in terms of the economics of this, in terms of redesigning packaging. And then we're going to have to go through a political process. Some of that's playing out in the multilateral level. Some of that's playing out in states where they're having this conversation, for example, in the U.S. and California, thinking about bans and so forth going forward. So it's about power, politics, and prices.
All right. Michael Dorsey, Isabel Hilton, last but not least, Wu Changhua. Thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.